on today's show.
I feel like that a lot of people have this fear of like coaching. Like there's a fear to it a little bit.
Well, you feel like, there must be something wrong with you, or it's a crutch, or and honestly, whenever we did talk about coaches, it was typically in that mode of, there's something wrong with them, we better get them a coach. I mean, that was literally the term we would use. They're deficient in this area, let's get them a coach. In my case, it was a kind of blindness to the need and opportunity. I would totally say to anybody now, the best sportsmen, the best, all have coaches. Yeah. Why wouldn't you?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Creator Institute podcast. Your host, Koester.
Why is a book such a powerful personal experience for so many people? Well, as I learned talking to Nick Lovegrove, writing a book forces us to come to grips with ourselves. A book is more than anything really a reflection of ourselves. And as Nick wrote in his book, The Mosaic Principle, he talked a lot about these principles behind being interesting today, by trying on lots of different things, by being sort of a generalist, a Renaissance man or woman, as a way to stand out today. But when Nick, at the time, who happened to be the managing director of McKinsey, looked at himself and said, am I really living these principles? He sort of had to question and see where it all went from there. Today, Nick is someone who is also a professor at Georgetown. He's doing kind of all sorts of new and innovative types of research and teaching on the principles of the Mosaic principles that he talks about being a generalist, learning these skills and standing out today. But what I think is powerful to understand in Nick's journey as an author, it really was an experience of self-reflection. It really helped him hone in on who he was and where he wanted to go, even though he was at the point in his life where his kids were now in college. He was thinking about kind of where his life headed, and it did force him to question it all, and today has led him on a path that may be different than he thought, but more importantly, it's a path that he's excited to be on. Nick Lovegrove, author of The Mosaic Principle. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Nick, great to have you today. This is fun. We've now known each other for about a little more than a year now, maybe. Yeah. And I think when we first met, you were just sort of in the throes of launching the book.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's been kind of interesting to see over the last year, this sort of, I'm guessing you probably didn't realize how much changed life would happen from launching a book.
No, not at
so
all.
I'm excited to have you today and talk a little bit about your book, your experience. And I want to start by talking about the first paragraph in your Christmas letter that you just sent out, which I guess is actually more of like a New Year's letter or a January letter.
It seems to be a kind of February letter these days.
So you talk about in your Christmas letter about the experience of your book, and your book we'll talk more about your book for sure, but your book talks about this sort of being well-rounded, not specializing, and here you are, 30 years sort of in an unspecialized but specialization, and you sort of, said like, listen, I'm going to try my hat at something different. Talk a little bit about kind of what is like 2018 looking like for Nick after 30 years of, in a lot of ways, doing similar things to now saying like, world's my oyster, I'm going to look at the world a little differently.
No, well, that's exactly right. I mean, I guess I see myself as at the start of a new chapter, and I don't know, what I said in that letter was that typically I think these chapters are 3 to 4 years, rather analogous to, high school years, college years, and then we get into a natural rhythm.
Right.
And so I feel like this is year one of, it's like being in year one of high school or year one of college. Everything's new, everything's different. I don't know exactly what I'm doing. I'm learning, from week to week, and I have no real conception of what I'll be doing in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but I'm excited at the opportunity. And, what I said about that in the letter and in my book was, this is a perfectly natural rhythm for us all. Mm-hmm. The only question is, when we come to the end of one of these chapters, do we change our lives completely, as I sort of have now, or do we just make or do we make it just a more of an adjacent move? So I stayed 30 years in the same firm, but when I look back on it, there were a whole series of different chapters, and some of them were modest; they were just sort of very close to what I had been doing. And there wasn't even a tangible stepping off point. It was just a continuation with an adjustment. And then there were others, obviously, most particularly for me, moving to the US and moving to Washington, which was really, quite a decisive thing. And I find that a natural thing, a refreshing thing. It certainly gives you the opportunity to think, kind of what do I want to do next,
right.
And how do I avoid getting too trapped in a pre-existing condition, as it were.
And so what was the, if you go back to that sort of moment where, you certainly could have, I mean, you're one of the experts, you've basically been a McKinsey guy. People could have at any point said, like, you've got this book, why don't you come back, and now you're even more more credible to be doing these things. What was sort of that moment when you said, like, no, I'm going to basically put a pin in this one and sort of really embrace this new chapter? Is there a moment you remember, or was there a set of things that happened?
I'm not sure it's a moment. I think there's it really comes down to, do you feel sufficiently in harmony and alignment with an organization, or do you feel like that you'd rather work to your own rhythm and your own guiding star? And I didn't find that alignment with the I left two organizations in the last 6 years, one McKinsey and then more recently Brunswick, and in both cases I just didn't feel that harmony, really. I felt like they were going in a different direction, I suppose, is the phrase. And I always used to say that it was when an organization moves from being a sort of inspiration to just slightly annoying.
Sure.
Sure. You feel like, well, maybe I should move on. And you can't be in those kind of places without being completely bought in. You have to. Right. You have to really go for it. And so, my search for independence and self-dependence, I suppose. Right. It's come pretty late. I mean, I'm nobody's idea of an early stage entrepreneur. But I guess I got there eventually.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting, sort of challenge to think through a little bit is it's almost easy to keep doing what we're doing in some ways, even if it's not, even if there's challenges with it, sort of, there's this, as you said, you sort of have this discovery period that you have to go through.
Well, and also when you are brought into an organization, all your motivation comes from within that organization. Mm-hmm. You want to ascend in it. You want to be promoted. You want to attain a relatively high status. You want more responsibility. When you've got it, you want to do well with it. You want to justify it. So, it's the question of why does somebody stay a long time in an organization, especially an organization that's all about challenge and like McKinsey is. And the answer is, I think you just become absorbed in the social organism. And also you have a tremendous amount of social capital. You have friends in other places and you do feel connected. Mm-hmm. And then at some point you don't.
That's right. Do you now that you've sort of made this transition, do you have people coming to you saying, like, how'd you do it? Like, how do you go through the process? Do people now come to you saying, like, you've left this? I mean, at a point where 30 years is a long time to put into something. Do people now come to you and say, Nick, Sherpa me through this like crazy next phase of my life?
I think for a lot of people there is so yes, I mean we all try to help each other really figure out what the next steps are, and I'm a little uneasy about being an advisor to people, people in their careers and their lives, because it's not like everything about mine has been perfect or that I've made all the right moves. I've made a lot of mistakes and misjudgments, but I certainly have some kind of relevant reflections, I suppose, on both what's happened to me and what I've done with it. Mm-hmm. So I enjoy reflecting upon that. That's why I wrote a book that was to large degree a reflection upon life so far. Yeah,
and so there's a the book's great. I think it's a very interesting one, but it also has this interesting kind of tension, right? I want to start with a little quote that you bring in the beginning that talks about Winston Churchill, which this is something I had not learned, but I'll read the very first sort of line is that in 1953, Sir Winston Churchill won a Nobel Prize. But here's the thing that I think you go on to say that's interesting about it. He won it in literature, right? So it's this, we would I don't know. I had no idea that was this sort of thing. So, when you were doing the research for this sort of thing, are most of the people that we sort of admire Winston Churchill-like, or are they these hyper specialists who are just world-class depth at one thing?
Well, the argument of the book is that we have moved too far in the direction of the specialist, or as I call it, the ultra specialist, in the organization of so many of our institutions, both corporate institutions and academic institutions, medical, and so forth. And that while it's totally understandable and in many ways has very positive benefits, has also sort of negative consequences, and that we need to be wary of over-dependence on ultra-specialists and indeed on ourselves becoming ultra-specialists. The question, therefore, is there an alternative model? And at the other extreme, of course, are the Renaissance people. I just finished the biography of Benjamin Franklin, who was obviously the complete opposite of that.
Right.
I mean, to call him a generalist or to call Churchill a generalist would be completely inappropriate. I mean, they were extraordinary multidimensional geniuses in many ways. But they represented a different model of life and success. And the fact that somebody like Churchill, for instance, who obviously had good times and bad, he had literally the wilderness years when he was, nothing good was happening, the point was that they very consciously and specifically devoted themselves to other pursuits and other activities than their kind of natural area or primary area of focus, and that enhanced them as people and as leaders. And that's the general theme of the book is since you never know where you're going to get inspiration from, give yourself more opportunities than you will ever get by just hoeing to a specific area of specialty.
Do you find that, I think obviously now that you're spending some of your time teaching young hearts and minds, there's this tension then, because I mean, obviously it's a world where you can learn anything, you can do anything, you can do these things. And yet the flip side of it is that leads you to a place where you have no depth.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the counsel you give to someone who's 22 years old saying like, Nick, your book's great, but like, what the hell am I supposed to do about it, right?
Well, the first thing I just wanted to be very explicit about is that this tension, as you accurately describe it, between breadth and depth, between generalism and specialism, is a lifelong tension. I mean, it's you can't avoid the tension. It's just there.
Right.
So better to understand it and always be thinking about it than to pretend it's not there. The second thing is it is a continuum. It's a spectrum. It's not, I'll be broad or, I'll be deep. It's where along that spectrum are you going to be and how do you navigate along it over the course of a life. There will be periods when you really want to, as it were, go deep, and periods when you want to broaden out, and that's fine. I mean, that's a good thing to be thinking in that way. There's one of the people I talk about in the book who said, well, look, there was a 15, 20-year period where I just had to really focus on this thing and nail it and be great at it. And then I got to the point of, okay, I've done that, now I feel pretty good about it. It's not enough. What else can I do? So to answer your question directly, when I talk to a 22-year-old about it, it is firstly to say this exists. This tension exists.
Let me define the world. It is this way.
Be ready. Understand that employers and others will specifically try to channel you into an area of depth and specialty. That's understandable. It's okay for some periods of your time you'll want to go with that, but don't allow yourself to become too captive of it. And I suppose the motif that I use to try to resolve this in some kind of definable way is the T-shaped idea, which is to say you need an area of depth, the vertical dimension, and you need to apply that depth across a broader arena than just one particular channel, as it were. So if you can think about yourself as having a spike, but also having breadth and a range of perspective and experience, that's the ideal. My only hesitation about the T-shaped model is it sounds very two-dimensional. It is down and across.
It is.
And I like to think of it as I prefer to think of something a bit more complex, like the mosaic, which is obviously the opposite. Mosaic is this lots and lots of colours and shapes. But I definitely think you've got to think in terms of at least 2 dimensions, if not more.
Mm-hmm. And do you find, you've got kids that are at this sort of point in life. I find, and tell me if you see differently, that we actually are sort of doing neither very well, like helping define the sort of, the top of the T, right? That sort of ability to sort of become sort of multidimensional, but we also don't really teach much about depth. And I think it's one of those things that it's why a lot of people feel like they're not fulfilled in their life and work. Why is that sort of the depth piece of it being so difficult? In some ways, it feels like we sort of got this blob that we're kind of like going along. What do you see that's holding people back from developing that depth?
I'm not sure. I think there's a lot that enables people to go deep if they want to. I mean, I think particularly in the academic environment, anybody in academia is going to have to choose an area of specialty. Right. Otherwise, they're not going to be an academic for very long. Right. Similarly in medicine, so I think there's a lot. I actually think there's a lot of institutional drive in this direction. I mean, McKinsey, where I was for a long time, it very much became the mantra of what's their spike, what's somebody's spike. That was the term. And it was meant as, what is somebody going to call them about? Now, I think you raised an interesting point. Is do those institutions actually help people to deal with the task of becoming a really productive expert, an expert, and I think that's a relevant question. But I would say a lot of time the problem with experts is lack of perspective, is lack of breadth of perspective. They just see things through a very narrow lens. And I, in the book and when I talk about it, I'm quite critical of people who just are blinkered and make a lot of mistakes as a consequence. Mm-hmm. You asked about my own kids, and you're right. I mean, I have kids, all in their early 20s or late teens, and they're, so to some degree, I'm now in a live laboratory, if you like.
You're trying to help them figure the spike and the foundation.
Yes. And my oldest son is a journalist, a very young journalist now, and it's very interesting to see the way his aspirations are developing. First of all, that he wants to be a journalist, not necessarily forever, but for now, it's a great discipline to learn, to be curious, to find things out. He has, for the moment, found a specialty that seems to have some kind of commercial value, which is very narrowly defined. It's South Carolina politics, which turns out to be pretty interesting and gives him a real... gives him a real calling card. Now, he's going to have to broaden out, or likely he's going to want to broaden out from that over time. Right. But for right now, it gives him something that he can get really expert about and really know a lot about, and people will call him, as they have been, to say, hey, what's going on in South Carolina politics? Mm-hmm. And that's a really interesting thing.
It's almost like celebra politics there, right? There's a different, you got some crazy characters.
At the age of 24, he turned up on national television because he knew a lot about South Carolina politics. Mm-hmm. And that's a pretty cool thing for his parents, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, but as we go in that route a little further, because I do think it's an interesting sort of question to look at this sort of, we'll call it like spikes, right? I think that McKinsey way you described it, spikes. When you were at McKinsey and you are sort of cultivating young talent, how much of that is driven by you, their manager, their boss, at the sort of management level, to sort of tell people, listen, I'm going to guide you to a spike? Because I almost wonder, we talked about a little bit earlier, there's sort of this momentum thing that you can just kind of keep doing what you're doing, and unless someone says it feels good to develop be these sort of we'll call it shallow sort of expertise over and over, but there's got to be a point when someone sort of needs to be that push. Did you find it's pushed or pulled from the
It's a bit of both. It's a talent marketplace. That sounds like, I'm not sure how good that sounds, but it's a talent marketplace in which there's supply and demand, and both the suppliers and the demanders are trying to create, make themselves attractive, as it were. If you're everybody's trying to sort of fashion their area of expertise and their area of contribution. They're trying to attract followers because having followers is kind of one indication of success, and also one way of achieving leverage and breadth of depth scale of capability. So you say to an up and coming person, develop this area of strength, and people will call you, and you'll be in demand, and you'll have lots of interesting work to do, and your career will be a success. And if you don't, the implied threat, if you like, is if you don't, nobody will call you,
right?
Because you'll just be a kind of generic all-purpose. Why would we need him or her? And that's kind of the way it is now. So it's actually quite an integrated system.
Sure.
Without with hardly any top down, or there's not even an invisible hand, really. Certainly no visible hand, but it is an organic system. It has evolved in a way that lends itself to this ultra specialization, because there are now so many people that everybody's trying to find their niche. And the only time it gets, you worry about it is when you think, well, I'm getting calls, I'm being asked to do things, but I'm only getting calls about one kind of thing. People only call me when they need an expert on this or that, and I have other interests. Why do I not get to apply them? Well, one frame I use is to say, when your level of expertise or depth has kind of 3 layers to it, then that's when, or even 4, that's when it starts to become narrowing. So what I mean by that is, if somebody's saying, well, so-and-so is an oil and gas expert in marketing in Eastern Europe.
I see.
And on oil, that's 3 levels of expertise. And there might even be a 4th, which would, I don't know what that would be. But then you're saying, okay, that's a pretty, it may still be quite substantial. Oil and gas marketing in Eastern Europe is a real thing. There's, but is that enough for you in your life?
I get this question a lot from people, like, what's the, people tell me I need to pick an area, pick an interest.
Yeah.
And my response to that is similar to what you said. I say, you just need to combine your interests.
Yeah.
So I talk about like this concept of Venn diagrams, and you should look at your circles, and the key part is you want to have sort of that breadth piece around multiple different areas, but look to see how big the circle is between those ones, and that can be your spike. So it's kind of an interesting assessment. How do you assess that sort of competency, interest, curiosity to sort of, we'll talk about those circles or layers as you called them.
Yeah.
What do you tell someone who's
actually, I think circles is better than layers in many ways. And
I think, can borrow it.
Yeah, so I think it's good. I will. I think it's better because it reflects the fact that you're looking for that sweet spot in the middle. I think it's a combination of the organic and the conscious, or the subconscious and the conscious. One of the things that a lot of very smart people have said is there is something natural about just finding what you like to do, and the way to figure that out is just to see what you find yourself doing.
Right,
I mean, for instance, I found I was hanging around universities in my late 50s, and it was like, well, it looks like you really want to spend time in universities. How can you do that? Given that you're not an academic and you don't have, so that was sort of.
Was that a conscious thing that you said as you were doing this thing, or did you sort of look and say, how am I doing my time? Because I feel like.
But it's a little bit. It's almost that playing hooky syndrome.
That's interesting. Yeah.
When you kind of find excuses to do things that are not valued by your employer. I mean, nobody was paying me to go and do talks at universities or appear on panels. I just would always say yes, and I'd always seek opportunities, and I would build friendships. And I would always feel slightly guilty about it. It was like, this is what and I would
wait a second, can I be doing this?
Saying, well, look, I've, been working for a long time. I should anyway. When you do that, there's something there, and the thing that I have become aware of through writing the book and through talking and thinking about it is how relatively little conscious thinking I did about my career.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like it feels like what you're sharing is that the consciousness of it is what's missing. And in some ways, maybe the book for you is this thing like, well, I've been successful, but maybe I've been successful without sort of really thinking through these principles. And now here you are, like you wrote a book and you're like, well, shit, now I got to apply these principles even more so. Like you'd been building all those things and stuff. So it's just interesting to hear you talk about it, because I think you sort of have had this awakening a little bit of the power of these things.
Yeah. So I think there's two dimensions to that. I agree with that. One is I now realize that I should have done more thinking about this earlier, and I might have made some different choices if I had, and if I'd had good mentors and thought partners in thinking about this as I had many friends and many people who helped me, but I'm not sure I had enough real reflective help, as it were.
Did you, before you go on though, did you have, this is something that I find fascinating. Did you have someone that you would say, you're having a successful career, you're the managing partner of McKinsey. I mean, it's a gigantic organization. It's what the perhaps, depending on the ranking, but the most prestigious management consulting firm in the world. Did you find that you had a coach, someone who's going to coach you on success? Because you're running one of, I mean, it's got to be hundreds of millions of dollars sort of like office. I'm just guessing, but like, did you have a coach?
No. And I realize now that was a big mistake. I mean, a huge mistake, actually. And I would use, now that I am coaching, and I view myself as sort of exhibit A of why you need one. What was I don't know. It wasn't typically something people did.
Yeah. Is there like a fear, I feel like that a lot of people have this fear of like, coaching, like there's a fear to it a little bit.
Well, you feel like, there must be something wrong with you, or it's a crutch, or and honestly, whenever we did talk about coaches, it was typically in that mode of, there's something wrong with them, we better get them a coach. I mean, that was literally the term we would use. They're deficient in this area, let's get them a coach. In my case, it was a kind of blindness to the need and opportunity. I would totally say to anybody now, the best sportsmen, the best, all have coaches. Yeah. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah. So Bill Campbell's daughter, Katie Bosey, was one of my students, and it was, Bill Campbell is like, the coach of Silicon Valley. Yeah. He passed away a year ago. Yeah. But it was fascinating hearing her describe him as that basically that he had been able to use the fact that he was a football coach as a way to sort of like make it acceptable. And there is this like real sense of, he's like, listen, I've been a football coach, I'm going to help you. But it feels that there is this like fear of it until we can, particularly a macho-ness of it. Like, and sports is sort of this great equalizer. I think it's a really interesting question that people, and I find, I kind of hate the word mentor. Like I really don't like it because it feels this like weird thing. I like coach a lot more. Yeah. But it's interesting question.
Even the uncertainty about that language, it sort of illustrates the fact this is still very poorly understood and poorly defined. So the answer to the question is no, I didn't. I should have. And it sounds odd to say this, but I think I would have lived a different life if I had. I mean, I think I would have made different choices. I think I would have done some things earlier than I did. And I mean, I'm happy. It's not like I had a bad time. The second thing I wanted to say, however, which I think is very important to my journey, which is you absolutely do reach this point. In my case, in my mid to late 50s. Maybe even a little bit earlier, when you really have to think hard about what the heck you're going to do with the rest of your life. Yeah. Because the one thing you become pretty conscious of is any notion that you're going to be able to attach yourself to an institution and they'll carry you along. Right. Forget all about that. Yeah. And there's a very specific phenomenon of firms like McKinsey and frankly most professional firms, most companies, which is, as they approach 60 or even once 60 comes into sight, what the heck are we going to do with these people? We don't want them around. Yeah. Except maybe the true superstars, the people who we can't do without because, they're the real quote unquote rainmakers. But for everybody else, it's like, thanks, but goodbye. So, and that's totally understandable. I mean, it's all, now that didn't used to be an issue 30, 40 years ago because that was retirement. Now it's an issue because nobody wants to retire and we all think we can live forever. And so now it's a very big deal to think as you come into your 50s, well, what the heck are we going to do?
Right.
As it happens, I was right at the tail end of an era when nobody really gave this much thought and nobody helped. I think firms like McKinsey have realized now that this is an issue and they are now giving people, as it were, coaching help to say, okay, what do you really want to do?
Yeah.
So that was just another dimension of it that was particularly important for me at the time.
Did you find when you're doing research on the book that as you're looking at these sort of, mosaics or these people that sort of have this, did you find that there was sort of a pattern of sort of almost it looks like a heartbeat on an EKG where they would have a spike and then they would sort of use some of this expertise and develop the next spike? You look at Churchill, obviously, who would have known? I mean, again, shocking to me that he would win a Nobel Prize in Literature, right? But maybe not surprising when you look at it. Or you talk about Ben Franklin. Did you see that as something that happened?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I started the book specifically to really explore people who went between government and business and the nonprofit sector. So it was couched in this or framed in this notion of a tri-sector athlete, and that was the original rationale for talking about it. Was and I still talk about we need more of these people who move between the sectors. When, particularly in the United States, where that's built into the system, because every new administration has to hire 3,500 people or maintain 3,500 political appointees, that create for some people that is a rhythm in itself, and it requires a jumping off and okay, what am I going to do now? So a number of the people that I profile in the book had exactly that that kind of life. So, for instance, Josh Gottbaum, who I talk about, who's a good friend, he has spent almost exactly half of his career in government and half of his career in business and the nonprofit sector, and that's simply because he had a kind of implicit decision rule that he was whenever the Democrats were in power, he would be in government, and when they were not in power, he wouldn't be. And that, in a sense, that makes it easy because you've got now. In the process of living that kind of life, he's actually become very knowledgeable about some specific things, about industry restructuring, particularly in the airline industry, and about pensions and pension reform, because he ended up running a pensions agency. And so he sort of exemplifies exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
I would say...
So basically that person, though, just to sort of say it clearly, is if you tell it to tri-sector, it's almost like that these folks, that people are triathletes is your word, and they're world class at it because they probably would never win any one of the disciplines if they were just doing that.
Right.
Josh, for example, he might not ever win a marathon or a bike race or the swim, but he's world class because he's able to very quickly boot up, become depth, build this spike, and then be able to leverage some of those same learnings to another spike in another area and go back. Is that kind of
I think that's exactly right. And that's exactly what he has done and some of the other people in the book have done. One of the challenges to that kind of life is, do you frame yourself in terms of the status that you've achieved? So you said it very well. You may never reach the highest level of any one thing because you don't have that same level of intensity and focus. But if you as and when you do become a leader, does that then become your defining characteristic? I'm a CEO. I have seen multiple people really struggle with that because they get to be a CEO and then they think, well, I'm a CEO. That's what I do.
Yeah, now I'm this. And
then they think, well, whenever I stop doing this thing, I'll have to be a CEO of something else.
Right.
And that is really tough. So one of the things that I think over a long career one has to accept, or at least deal with, is there are going to be very significant variations in one sort of level of seniority and status and support and so on. And you're going to have to get your head around that.
Right.
So right now, for instance, I'm somebody who had the corner office. I had two full-time assistants. My schedule was completely locked in, and I basically I was in that kind of what's next mode. I would turn to my assistant and say, "What am I doing now?" Now I'm completely the opposite. I am
getting your own coffee in the morning.
Getting my own coffee. I have no assistant. I have no support. I write all my own presentations. I'm sitting there doing PowerPoint presentations that 5 years ago a 23-year-old would have been doing for me.
Right.
I'm so fine about that. Yeah. And the fact that I am fine about it tells me I'm doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Rather than constantly cursing and say, why can't I get somebody to do my charts for me? And why can't I get somebody to organize my schedule? So,
it's actually a really, what I would say from it is if you think about this to someone who's, 40s, 50s, 60s in their career, this is sort of like, you're almost saying it as like, you just got to be prepared for this thing. Yeah. But I actually think that, sort of it's a reality and maybe it's bad and, whatever, you may not have been used to this. But if you flip this around to someone who's 23 and there is this fear of like, I think there's a little fear of specialization because you may pick something wrong. Yeah. What's actually kind of interesting about what you said is that it's about sort of the success, the happiness from a lot of these folks can be about thinking of yourself as a triathlete where you can be specialized, but that doesn't mean that you are focused forever. Yeah. And so I think the story that you share of Josh is actually kind of an attractive one listen, the world today is accepting of triathletes, right? It's not necessarily that you have to be the, best in the world at this one thing, but actually you can be pretty damn good at a bunch of things depending on this time and space, but don't also let yourself never get anywhere good. I think this, you're talking about this middle path, which is become really good at it, but you don't necessarily have to then sort of say that's all that you're defined by.
So just here's take the sporting motif, which was in my mind all the time. There's the triathlon and then there's the decathlon.
Yeah.
And
interesting.
So what's the difference? I mean, I'm guessing that, triathlon is only 3 sports. You have to be pretty darn good at all of them. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I don't think you can win the triathlon if you're, for instance, you can't be one of the best triathletes if you're a lousy swimmer. You've got to be at least a decent swimmer, because the swim is the first thing. And if you're, minutes or ages behind, once you finish
I'm doing the side stroke here, barely logging
exactly.
in. Yeah.
And, I'm guessing people, well, I know that triathletes spend as much time on the discipline they're least good at as the discipline they're best at, maybe more. Because they've got to bring them all up to a decent standard. If you're a decathlon, wow, it gets that much more difficult because 10 is a lot.
10's a lot.
And there may be 2 or 3 of those disciplines that you're just lousy at, I mean, to be a good sprinter and to be a good
pole vaulter
or javelin thrower or whatever, I mean, those are very different things.
Right.
So
could you sandbag on one in that case, whatever,
I guess I'm probably saying that life is more of a triathlon than a decathlon.
But I think that's
I mean, Churchill was a decathlon. He's like the least likely decathlete you can ever imagine.
Right.
Because,
as he did cigarettes and whiskey.
But he had 8 to 10. Franklin, although he always referred to himself as a printer, was 8 to 10 things. Mm-hmm. And at least 7 or 8 of them he was pretty darn good at. Mm-hmm. He was a, borderline scientific genius. Mm-hmm. Invented a whole bunch of things, that we depend on now. That's a remarkable thing, but there are very few people who... So I would say, if you can think of 3 things that you can be pretty good at over a lifetime, that's not bad as a framework for that.
And I think it goes back to these sort of Venn diagram circles a little bit. If you can be developing those 3 circles, and then in some cases you might be focused on one circle, but it may bleed into these others. I just interviewed one of my former students, Matt Bussell, who wrote a book on augmented reality and sports. And those 2, I asked him, why did you pick those? He's like, well, I realized if I'm going to be doing something to write a book on this for a year, I might as well pick the 2 areas I'm most interested in, which was tech and it was sports. And what's interesting is that led him to do a business. He's now one of the employee number 5 at a tech startup in New York, in virtual reality, augmented reality, and commerce. So the book got him in because he had this depth that he could show off, but it's one of those circles. And he's like, listen, someday I'd like to be in sports, but I'm able to now develop this depth in the tech and move back out. So I think I think what I like about what you're saying in this kind of think of the world as yourself as a triathlete is that it's crazy for people to think, especially at 21, 22, that I've got to be a world-class pick one sport. Yeah. It's also it's probably not great just because of the issues with being a decathlete, where you've got to become. Yeah. You never really develop the depth if you do 10 sports. But 3 is kind of an interesting place, and like find those interests where they overlap. Kind of an interesting place to land. Yeah, and it gives you an organized framework for life, which I think so many of us want. Really, is okay. What am I? The Stanford Design School has a very interesting body of work about really applying design methodologies to life. And career design, and they use the framework of having 3 Odyssey plans, and they say you should have one plan that is just continuity, a second plan that is adjacency, and a third plan that is kind of dream state, if you like. And if you can think, so that's another organizing framework. It has that, because it's 3 and we can pretty much hold 3 things in our mind at the same time, it provides a focus, provides a framework that we can organize ourselves around. And again, when I reflect upon it, I didn't have that. I never really had that. I had continuity, and I maybe had a little bit of adjacency, and that was kind of it, really. And I would even say, maybe as an entrepreneur, on the flip side of it, I was a little bit more on the decathlon side, and at times would sort of trying everything. And I think as I've sort of found myself moving towards like getting focused, there's this, you've heard the Warren Buffett 25-5 rule, where you list out the 25 things you're most excited about, interested in, and you rank them every month, every quarter, whatever it is. Wow. And then you religiously and relentlessly avoid doing 6 through 25 because those are the things that will distract you from being good at 1 through 5. Yeah. And I think it plays into this very well of, again, I think it plays a lot of what you're talking about. It plays well into this fear that people have of picking something. Yeah. If you pick something, you're going to close the doors to everything else. And it's not what it is.
But if you pick
4
things or 5 things. Yeah. I mean, there's another interesting book that I drew upon for my own book. It's called The Renaissance Soul by Margaret Lobenstein. And she similarly kind of framed, I don't think she uses the Buffett rule, but she sort of similarly talks about, actually, she says 4 things, or 4 or 5, that you can keep in your mind at one time. But if it's become 7 or 8 or 10 or 20, then it's just, that's just general knowledge. There's nothing, general knowledge is a good thing, but it's not really applicable in there's one other thing that I think is so important in the context of what we're talking about, is when it comes to writing a book or writing any sustained piece of putting any sustained piece of work together, that obviously requires a degree of focus and choice and inquiry and real desire to know and to be able to express and to force yourself to say, okay, what am I trying to say here?
If you choose that, it's deep thinking.
Yeah, and I think that process of selection and so the irony of my book is I wrote a book about breadth, but I had to go deep in order to do it. I often observe that, I am now a quote unquote expert on breadth, if you like, which is kind of perverse, but interesting.
You are just a big enigma wrapped in mystery, shrouded in confusion.
Something like that.
It's no, but I think what's, I think as I reflect a little bit on this conversation, and it's really interesting because I think you do basically say the world lives in a bit of nuance today, which is this sort of middle ground that we talk in specialization or generalization. And the reality is, like, sort of the principles is that this place in the middle is where all the magic really happens. Yeah. And I do like your idea of where do you play hooky and start to identify those interest places, and don't be afraid to develop depth, because basically life today moves fast enough that you probably will get to develop depth somewhere else, but also don't let that stop you from developing.
Well, at a minimum, have a hinterland that gives you opportunities, and that's at a minimum. You may want more than that. You may want to develop, as I say, these 3 areas of expertise, of which you can choose one at any one time, or these 3 arenas that you're comfortable in. I met a fascinating man at Stanford who, what used to be the dean of Stanford Medicine, and he said that he was a doctor, obviously, and a specialist doctor. I mean, as a clinical pediatric oncologist, and he said that all his working life as a doctor, he had always thought that there come a day when he would he wanted to do a history PhD, and as a consequence, he read history a lot, and became specialized in sort of 18th century European history. And then there came a point where he wasn't going to be a doctor anymore. Certainly wasn't going to run a big medical institution anymore. And he said, I didn't do a history PhD, but what he did do was he launched a venture at Stanford that was all about later stage career rethinking, very much what we were talking about earlier, and really trying to inspire people to make best use of their sort of later years. So just the very fact that he had that hinterland, that he was thinking all along about, well, what am I going to do when nobody wants to run a medical institution anymore? That was good for him.
This has been super interesting. I love it. This is fun, and thank you for spending the time with me. I'm sure now we're gonna have to do this again, but I appreciate it, and we'll get this out there.
Thank you very much indeed.